So let's talk about the poetry of Derek Mahon. Mahon is one of the 3 Irish poets prescribed for study for 2025. He is a narrative poet whose poems are populated by characters and feature dramatic scenarios which are tremendously interesting. He's not really a lyric poet. He doesn't really write about his own life, although there are elements of his life, of course, like any poet's work, in his poetry. I'm going to start by saying to you, we're on page 147 in your paper 2 notes book. But I'm going to start by just looking at probably the poem you know most intimately or with greatest detail, because every teacher teaches this poem when Mahon's on the course. It's called After the Titanic. So let's have a quick look at this poem, and let's think about the key moments and the key themes and the key quotes from the poem. So as you know, it is quite typical of, and don't forget the reason that text box is there so you can write notes. As you know, that the poem is quite typical of Mahon's style in that it is inspired by the past. The person in the picture is called Bruce Ismay. Bruce Ismay was the CEO of the White Star Line, which was the company that owned the Titanic. He was on the ship the night in 1912 and hit the iceberg and sank, and he survived the disaster by taking his place in a lifeboat. After the disaster, he was vilified or condemned as a coward and blamed. He was used as the scapegoat for the disaster, and there were all sorts of stories told about him telling the captain to speed up the ship and ignore the warnings of the ice fields, which is all nonsense. So Mahon decides to write this poem in the voice of Bruce Ismay. And that alone is highly imaginative. And he, in the poem, uses Ismay to, I suppose, look at the idea of trauma and of human frailty. I don't think Ismay is in any way, I don't think Mahon tries to redeem Ismay's character in this poem. But what Mahon does here is to try to look at these events from the perspective of Ismay. And that's a motif in Mahon's work. He tries to see the world through the eyes of others. And that means that the experience of reading his poetry is enriching. That he's looking at, and through him we are looking at, the world in a way which is fresh and unusual and interesting and very much human. The opening of this poem is set in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster. I'm just going to read the opening sequence very quickly. They said I got away in a boat and humbled me at the inquiry. I tell you, I sank as far that night as any hero. As I sat shivering on the dark water, I turned to ice to hear my costly life go thundering down in a pandemonium of prams, pianos, sideboards, winches, boilers bursting, and shredded ragtime. Now, it really is testament to Mahon's wonderful control over language, that piece of description. From here, down to there, I mean, you could learn the whole thing. I know you won't. But what you've got there is a marvellous piece of immersive, descriptive writing that appeals to the senses. Mahon, through Ismay, tells us that he was brought before an inquiry and he was humbled. Humbled means humiliated. He was told that he was responsible for the disaster and that he was a coward who got away in a boat. But from his perspective, his life ended that night. He sank down to the bottom of the ocean, metaphorically speaking, in the same way as literally so many heroes, those who are lost in the disaster, literally died. Now, that statement alone is worth investigating, because it suggests self-pity and a lack of perspective and understanding of the gravity of the loss of life. But nevertheless, it is important that we get that insight into Ismay's character, that he feels that this night, his life may not literally have ended, but metaphorically, figuratively speaking, for all intents and purposes, his life was over. What really matters, though, is the skill of the writer in this sequence I've highlighted. When you look at that sequence, you see the use of sibilance in as I sat, which somehow captures the sat shivering, the impact of the traumatic impact of the night. We can hear the onomatopoeia of thundering and of bursting. So that aural sense is provoked. I paused there. You can hear me pausing there because I was looking at the alliteration of boilers, bursting, the alliteration of prams, pianos, and the S's all the way through. Pianos, sideboards, winches, boilers, bursting. Pandemonium as well, in terms of the alliteration. And it's just a really cinematic piece of writing. It's like we're sitting on the boat, shivering, as we sit shivering, and we're hearing the pandemonium, the chaos. We're hearing the band who are playing ragtime, that's a style of music that was popular at the time, become shredded as the boat slides and all the musical instruments crash. We're hearing the explosion of the boilers bursting. We're hearing the noise of the ship as it thunders down to the bottom of the ocean. We're seeing this disaster as all of the little details, the winches, the sideboards, all the human touches, the pianos, the prams, there were children on the ship. It's an extraordinarily vivid, powerful piece of descriptive writing. And on its own, it makes this poem worth reading. So this is man bringing the night of the disaster to life from the perspective of an eyewitness. And then he allows that witness to talk about what his life was like after the Titanic. It's why the poem was called After the Titanic. Now, he says, I hide in a lonely house behind the sea. Again, I love the adjective-noun combination, lonely house. It's an unusual use of adjectives. We don't think of a house as being a lonely place, but nobody can comfort him. He is utterly alone. And he says, the tide leaves broken toys and hat boxes at his door. Now that's clearly an example of metaphor. There aren't the floating remnants of the disaster washing up at his door every morning. But of course, what he means is that he can never forget the sights that he saw that night. What he means is that even years later, and Bruce Ismay lived for a couple of decades, he lived into the 1930s, he was haunted by the events of that night, that he was never able to recover from the trauma of the events of that night. And that's further emphasized when he says, these images of the passage of time, the showers of April, flowers of May mean nothing to me, nor the late light of June, when my gardener describes to strangers how the old man stays in bed on seaward mornings after nights of wind, takes his cocaine and will see no one. Then he says, it is, I drown again. See that? With all those dim, lost faces I never understood. My poor soul screams out in the starlight. Heart breaks loose and rolls down like a stone. And then the famous final line. Include me in your lamentations. Is man trying to make us feel sorry for Bruce Ismay? No. Is he challenging us to think about a familiar story from a different perspective? Yes. when he describes Ismay's zombie-like existence as the years pass by and nothing changes for him because he's stuck on that night in April 1912. He's stuck there. His life will never move on. When he describes him taking drugs to try and kill the pain, when it describes him every night screaming and drowning, when he describes that, and even when he has that rather pathetic last line, include me in your lamentations, Mahon is challenging us to think about something. The world isn't always, and the world isn't only as we see it. Different people experience different things in different ways. Bruce Ismay is a famous historical figure who was involved in one of the most famous events of the last 500 years of world history. He has been caricatured as a selfish, rich villain. But what Mahon is saying in this poem is, maybe that's true, but maybe that's not all there is to it. Maybe he's a human being who is flawed and prone to self-pity and maybe cowardly, but a human being who suffers, and therefore, as a human being who suffers, he is like us, and we shouldn't maybe judge him as harshly. I think it sums up Mahon's poetry, this poem, because it is inspired by real historical events. It's really narrative style storytelling, immersive description built around a character and a particular scenario, and deeply thought-provoking. Stays with you because it challenges you, and it challenges your perspective on life and our attitudes to other people.